are beginning to a new phase, which will be the political phase, and the problems there are in many ways even more daunting than the military problems that we faced up to now. The interests of the various countries of the region are so disparate. To try and get them together, to make some coherent structure for security, to get some movement on the Palestinian-Israeli problem. These are really very, very daunting problems for our diplomats and politicians.
Thank you very much indeed. And will I see you tonight?
Yes, indeed.
Oh, good, because we're going to record the Radio 4 debate, but that's a secret. Now, Jihad Abdul Hadi is on a line from somewhere. Sir, have you got all the morning papers?
Yes, I have.
Right, which is the worst?
It depends on what's the criteria that you would like to judge against. But anyway, on the same subjects of the United resolutions being disregarded and the role of Iran, you'll find these two subjects have been talked about also by two of the main Arab newspapers being published here in London, namely Al-Quds Al-Arabi and Al-Arab. Al-Arab in its editorial, it calls for jihad, not by weapons only, but also it calls for an economic, political, cultural, and even social boycott of the coalition countries. At the same time, it has criticized bitterly the Arab governments which supported the coalition.
Just explain to me who that paper is written for and aimed at.
Al-Arab is a Libyan-owned newspaper, but has been published here in London for a long time. And Al-Quds Al-Arabi is a moderate pan-Arab national newspaper, also published here in London. And it also talks about the Iranian role in this conflict, saying that the Iranian revolution has betrayed the principles of Khomeini when he was talking about the great Satan, meaning the United States of America. And now they have missed a historical opportunity by not playing their own role in that conflict. And also, as we would expect, it said that Kuwait was merely a pretext for the coalition and the Americans to destroy Iraq and occupy its territories. At the same time, there are two other newspapers which are also published here in London. Al-Hayat, which is a Lebanese-owned newspaper, but it's a pro-Saudi newspaper. It runs all the statements by the military spokesman of the coalition, and its main headline runs as follows: Kuwait has been freed, its emir declares martial law, and the coalition forces crosses the Euphrates to encircle the Iraqi Republican Guards. As for the Al-Sharq Al-Awsat, it is a Royal Saudi mouthpiece published here in London, and as expected also, it runs the following headline saying that Kuwait is restored as a free country and Saad al-Abdullah is going to be its military ruler. And it all
now estimated as being as high as 50 to 60,000. Well, with more news on the briefing, our correspondent in Paris, Stephen Jessel, is on the line now. Right, Steve, what have you learned?
Well, this was a briefing by General Maurice Schmidt, who is the chief of the French General Staff, the most senior soldier here in France. Some figures: you mentioned the 50 to 60,000 prisoners, which he said had now been taken. He also gave a new figure for the number of divisions, the Iraqi divisions that are still in a position to fight. He said there were no more than 15 of the original 42, suggesting that 27 have been knocked out in some way or another. He gave some casualty figures. The French have taken their first casualties, 2 dead in an operation to clear mines or booby traps from a fort they'd captured, 25 injured in similar operations. Of the US units under French operational control, they have taken 7 dead too, including 2 officers and an unspecified number injured. So there have been casualties, not on a huge scale. He also confirmed what I think we've known for a long time, this is General Schmidt, that there has been a vast flanking movement involving French and American troops. The French are now guarding the western edge. The Americans are on the Euphrates, certainly in Al-Nasirah, possibly other places too. And also Schmidt confirmed that there are 2 divisions of the Republican Guard are trying to fight their way or make their way back to Basra 3 are standing firm and fighting, and 1 has been destroyed, presumably by American and British forces, since the French are some 500 kilometres away from the action.
Did they have any news of the Republican Guard, which always sounds like a French unit anyway, doesn't it?
Well, only that these of 6 divisions. It's not clear how many divisions at the moment they have, but 2 are trying to get back to Basra, and 1's destroyed, and 3 are apparently still fighting. Interestingly, he was asked why he thought that they hadn't used chemical weapons.
That's tempting providence.
It was indeed. In his view, it was only a hypothesis, he said, but he produced this perhaps slightly curious view that the generals had indeed been told to do so, but knowing that they were going to have to account for what they'd got up to in Kuwait City, or what their forces had done, they balked at this, and they thought that they already had enough to answer for, and were therefore not prepared to use chemical weapons.
Now, I had a Frenchman on earlier this morning. He's the brother of your new defence minister.
Alain Jox, yes.
That's right, and he was a bit cross about the whole thing. He seemed to think that France, as it were, had had its foreign policy kidnapped. Is that a common view?
Well, a common view, no, because there is still massive support for what's happening, but a view across the political spectrum, yes, not confined to people like Alain Jox at all. The French have always regarded their foreign policy as something that is very specific to them. It's the way that the French mark the fact that they are not Anglo-Saxons or Germans or Italians or anyone else. And the fact is that they have rather been dragged along in recent weeks and months by an American foreign policy. And there is a degree of opposition, as I say, by no means confined to the left, which says, here we are, we have fought all these years, we've had these goalist legacies and so forth. What has happened? We are simply a supporting actor, a spear carrier in a drama entirely populated by Americans, and to a very considerably lesser extent the British.
Well, now, do you think that the whole world is a different place? I mean, in Paris, are they already beginning to say we've got to rethink our Europe?
Well, the French have got to rethink virtually everything. It's a point that's been made before, that the French have not come out of this conflict very well, although their military action, which seems to have been well and bravely executed, has gone some way to restoring things. But they have tremendous amount of fence mending to do in the Arab world. Mitterrand is a hate figure in the Maghreb. Their Cavalier Seul, their individual initiatives in the hours and days leading up to January the 16th was, shall we put it mildly, not particularly appreciated in London and Washington. The European political unity, you can argue about this. One would like to be able to argue that it reinforces the need for political unity, but it's hard to say that on the basis that things have advanced very much. There is a gigantic amount of fence mending to be done by the French, and Mitterrand said this morning, of course, that we are not going to Baghdad. We are not interested in going that far, marking out, again, a French position.
Stephen Jessel, thank you very much. Paul Reynolds is just going, but he'll agree with me that if the war is not over, at least this is the beginning of the end of the war. Yes? And that's it. Well, from Radio 4 News FM this morning, I think it's Nick Clark this afternoon at 20 to 2. But from me, good morning.
The time now is 5 to 1, and time for the weather forecast from John Parris at the London Weather Centre.
Good afternoon. Well, it's a cloudy prospect for most of us, the cloud thick enough in places to give some rain as well. At least there's a hint now of some brighter weather edging in from the southwest. Let's start the detail with all of England, but leaving out that southwestern corner for the moment. And for the most part, it's a cloudy afternoon, quite misty in places, and in fact quite dull at times. There'll be some dry weather around, especially over northern England.
The scars of the Iraqi occupation. In a brief drive around the centre, I saw parts of buildings destroyed, the rubble strewn across nearby roads. Other buildings are black with smoke, and yet more have windows and doors smashed. It's clear that wide-scale pillaging has taken place. There are cars abandoned in the middle of motorways, stripped bare of anything of value. The people who live here say a nightmare has ended. They speak of murder, torture and kidnapping. They say anyone suspected of being with the Kuwaiti resistance was killed. One British woman who lives here with her Kuwaiti husband told me how a relative was murdered by Iraqi troops and her body dumped outside her family's home. Another man says 3 members of his family have been taken by force to the Iraqi city of Basra. Now that the Iraqis have gone, the only shooting to be heard here is that carried out by joyful Kuwaitis, firing into the air the Iraqi weapons that were left behind. There are also tanks and trucks which the Iraqis were forced to abandon. A few minutes ago I saw a teenage boy climb to the turret of one such tank and hang a Kuwaiti flag from the gun.
The Iraqis have admitted for the first time that Allied forces are operating deep inside Iraqi territory on the Euphrates River. A broadcast on Baghdad radio said paratroops had landed at an air base in the province of Dikar, where the city of Nasiriyah is situated. Nasiriyah is reported to be a strategic centre which, if captured, would cut off the main route for Iraqi troops pulling back from Kuwait. American military officials say Iraqi forces in southern Iraq are almost completely encircled. A British military spokesman in the Saudi capital, Riyadh, has said that the Iraqis haven't given up fighting completely. Group Captain Neil Irving said the Allied campaign was going extremely well, but there were still sophisticated tanks and artillery pieces to overcome, as well as thousands and thousands of Iraqi soldiers.
We are meeting pockets of resistance further back, and we are meeting better trained and, more importantly, better fed troops further back. So caution is the name of the game at the moment, and it is essential that we go forward very carefully and that we ensure that we don't take any unnecessary casualties. There is still a huge army out there.
Other news now. Most major building societies have...
FM, this is Nick Clark through... Till 5 o'clock I shall be with you, and I still have here in the studio with me Adela and Zara, two of the Kuwaiti exiles who've been coordinating information out of Kuwait during the long period of occupation and who've been celebrating here this afternoon their feelings about the liberation of the city. You were listening also to this Colonel Fahad in Kuwait City talking, and when he said that he didn't think there would be any requirement or desire for revenge against Palestinians, you shook your head, Zara.
I don't want to revenge against anybody, but we have to be very careful now. Who lives among us? We have to know who had helped us and very carefully who didn't, and who are the informers and the spies, because they were, and we saw them. You can't just say the leader and that's it, but there were people there who spied and who were informers and who were actually helping the Iraqis. And some of the English people who were in hiding said even my intelligent neighbor, I saw him pointing to my house, to the Iraqis. So it's going to be very difficult, and we have to be wise about it. But we have to know who is it and bring him to justice, because...
Like the coalition governments, has said to Saddam Hussein that we want a formal and public undertaking of surrender, and it is evidence of Saddam Hussein's inhumanity that he isn't speedily responding to that offer and saving a lot of lives on both sides.
Are the Allies compounding his inhumanity by in a sense letting his troops and perhaps our troops suffer?
It would be impossible to ask any forces engaged in the liberation of Kuwait or in the theatre generally to accept as straightforward the idea of an armoured personnel carrier or a tank or even a lorry with armed troops aboard being ready to surrender. Unless there is evidence of troops departing from their vehicles and laying down their arms, then the assumption has got to be, in the interest of the safety of our forces, that they are intent upon aggression themselves. One hopes that the Allies will intensify their efforts to communicate to the Iraqi forces that they can surrender safely if they surrender clearly. I know efforts are being made. As much effort as possible should be made, including broadcasting to the Iraqi forces.
In terms of winning the peace afterwards, isn't there a danger of pursuing the war to such a complete victory that peace is made more difficult?
I think it's very important that the limitations stated by the coalition governments, repeated by the United Nations on the war aims, are maintained. They certainly are a very important subscription to the securing of stability in Iraq and stability and peace in the region post-war. I think everyone understands that, which is why the statements on the limitation of war aims have been so clear.
Neil Kinnock. Well, it's at this stage in the afternoon that we often go over, as we're going to do now, to our correspondent Diana Goodman in Washington. She's been monitoring the American media's coverage of the war.
Back now, 8 o'clock. It's a Wednesday morning, the 27th morning, February of '91. After 6 weeks of bombing and 4 days of ground war, the Allies are in Kuwait City. The city would appear to have been liberated. The battle to oust Iraq all but over. Already, many in the Arab world are already looking ahead to post-war considerations. We'll take that up this morning on After 8, see what some of them are.
All the networks this morning were leading on the liberation of Kuwait City, and like the others, NBC now has a correspondent in place there. But for a day, CBS was way in front of the field. One of its correspondents, Bob McEwen, was the first American reporter into Kuwait City after the Iraqis began to flee. There's great admiration at competing networks for McEwen's scoop, and in the way of American television, this morning he decided it was important to tell his viewers about how the liberation of Kuwait City figured in his own life, as well as explaining the feelings of the beleaguered local residents. His report was introduced by Harry Smith.
CBS newsman Bob McEwen brought America the first live pictures yesterday from Kuwait City, a city liberated, and he joins us again now after being in that city over 24 hours. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning, Harry. Well, I think you can hear behind me that the celebration has begun in earnest. When we arrived yesterday afternoon, the people we encountered couldn't believe we were here, and they cheered and kissed us and jumped around. Well, today, all of Kuwait City is doing that. This is really one of the most remarkable things I've been through. I think when we came down the highway and realized we could get to the capital yesterday, it was the second greatest thrill I had after the birth of my son, and today's right up there as well. People are just jubilant that 7 months under Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi army is over, and that life can get back to normal finally here in Kuwait.
Bob, what can you tell us, and I know you can't be all places at all times, but we were hearing about a battle at the airport, and now we're hearing from U.S. military sources that the airport is secure. Can you tell us about what's gone on there in the last 24 hours?
Well, I can't tell you whether the airport is secure or not, but I can tell you that we've stopped hearing the sounds of battle that we were hearing last night here. On both sides of us, there was bombardment of one sort or another. This morning, there was a bomb which went off just about 200 or 300 yards behind me. And there was some small arms fire, perhaps sniper fire, across the street. We went over to the U.S. Embassy to check the security there, and there was a firefight going on not far away from that. So there has been war activity here. As far as the battle at the airport is concerned, a couple of U.S. Marines who had already arrived at the embassy in Kuwait City last night came to see us to tell us that things were still a little bit iffy. And they said that at that time there was a fierce battle, as they put it, going on between Marines and Iraqi troops at the airport. They said the real thing, and they wanted us in some way, if we could, to send a message to the boys fighting out at the airport that the embassy here in Kuwait City was secure, to bolster their morale. We do occasionally today hear some sort of salvo coming in from the Gulf, a warship firing. That doesn't appear to be very close to us now.
Bob, one of the things we've heard so much about, and especially in the last week or two, is stories of incredible atrocities that were committed against the Kuwaiti people by Saddam Hussein's soldiers. Have you had any opportunity to check out any of those stories?
It's impossible to be here for long and to talk to the people who have gone through the past 7 months without hearing those stories. Everyone has one or more than one. We spoke to a man this morning who told us about something that took place in the parking garage in his apartment block.
And they brought them over here in this place, and they just shot them and killed them and left them for 5 days.
5 people left here for 5 days?
Yes, exactly. Just like a garbage. Okay, and they threatened us not to touch them, not to remove them. Otherwise, the whole people over here will be killed the same way.
There is no logic behind it. I mean, the whole thing is violence for the sake of violence, destruction for the sake of destruction, and killing for the sake of killing. If you go around Kuwait now, I mean, the country has been literally sodomized. I mean, it's a massacre for a whole nation. I mean,
now we are here 7 months like dead people, and now we are in the life.
Those are some of the people to whom we spoke in Kuwait City this morning. You can speak to almost anyone and get the same kind of story, unfortunately.
Bob McEwen's success in being the first American correspondent to reach Kuwait City is being played for all it's worth by CBS, because until the last few days, the network had been losing badly in the fight to get the best ratings for coverage of the war. The Washington Post reported yesterday that the journalist who'd been in charge of the news desk at CBS Evening News for the past 14 years, Lee Townsend, was abruptly fired on Friday night after 24 years with the network. Not surprisingly, Mr. Townsend was bitter when he spoke to the Post, recalling how much he'd done for CBS, including having a heart attack during the TWA hijack story because of the pressure. But the viewers, of course, were not told about the blood on the carpet at CBS headquarters. Instead, the main anchorman, Dan Rather, was asked to explain what instructions the network's correspondents were given.
Go north, keep going north, get as close as you can to the battle area. And one of the goals all along was to try to be first to broadcast live out of Kuwait City. And they just kept kept driving. They also got help from U.S. Marines, from the 1st Cav of the U.S. Army, and from a number of the Arab Army people, including the Egyptians. All of those people were of great help.
There has been some debate here that I'm sure you're aware of that perhaps the news has been jeopardizing, or there's a possibility that it's been jeopardizing our troops.
Well, we're very aware of that, and we've tried to work with the military very closely. We didn't want anything that we did, or still do, to in any way jeopardize not only any American troops, but any other of the Allied troops. No one in the military has complained that we have endangered anyone. They haven't always agreed with our coverage, and we wouldn't be much as independent American journalists if they agreed with everything. But I think that they do agree that we have tried hard not to endanger a single American life. We certainly didn't want to.
Dan Rather has been criticised for being too prone to emotion as an anchorman, although his fans say they like him because he appears to be so involved in some stories and because he reacts like a normal person. Yesterday he broke down in the middle of a live link about the US troops who have been fighting this war.
It was Napoleon who said, victory has 1,000 fathers, defeat has none. There are going to be a lot of people claiming victory for this, politicians all over the Middle East and not confined to the Middle East. We talked about the flag rank people who've done such a terrific job, but it may be time to just pause for a second and say, listen, the guys who do it are the grunts, the mud soldiers, foot soldiers, those pilots in the airplanes and the maintenance crew, rank and file Americans. They're the ones who have delivered this tremendous victory in the desert.
Some of them have been living there for 6 months, Dan. I had an opportunity to meet many of them. We America sent its best, I think, to live in this desert. They impressed me continually with their patriotism and their willingness to sacrifice on behalf of their country.
Later, Dan Rather defended his momentary loss of control.
Well, it certainly touched me, John. When you see these young American men and women out here, they're the people who did it. They're the people who put themselves on the line, and they're the people who deserve the credit, the ribbons, the medals, the ticker tape parades.
For many television viewers here, it was the pictures of the exhausted and defeated Iraqis which brought home for perhaps the first time the human side of the war, and a realization that probably thousands of reluctant and frightened conscripts were killed in the air bombardment which was needed to soften up the Iraqi defenses in advance of the ground war. The US military says that more than 30,000 Iraqis have now given themselves up to become prisoners of war, and the figure is rising all the time. There are said to be too many to count. Reporter Richard Threlkill was with a group of Egyptian soldiers when hundreds of Iraqis called it quits.
They emerge from the desert mist like ghosts ahead of the lead elements of Egyptian armor, first a few and then whole platoons. Iraq's frontline soldiers coming out of their trenches and surrendering without even firing a shot. They're surrounded and ordered to kneel at gunpoint. You can see the terror in their eyes. Oh, God, they're going to kill us now. And then relief when they realize they will not die, and their cries of salam, salam, peace, peace, will be heard. A moment ago, they were enemies, these Egyptians and these Iraqis. Now, though, when it's over, victor and vanquished together chant Allahu Akbar, God is great. These Iraqis would rather surrender to the Egyptians than to the American army. The Americans treat their prisoners well, of course, but the Iraqis don't know that. And the Egyptians are, after all, fellow Arabs, fellow Muslims. It's a drama that's been played out day and night, over and over again, all along the Egyptian advance. This one battalion alone has picked up more than 1,000 prisoners. Why do they surrender? Because they say they are tired of war, tired of the American bombs, and because they're desperately hungry and thirsty. Their officers deserted them, they say, the moment the Allied attack began. And it's apparent just how hungry and tired and dispirited they are. For most, this is the first food and drink they've had in days. They're told they'll be well treated, fed and clothed and cared for, until, no doubt, in a not-too-distant future, they'll be sent home to an Iraqi nation just as destitute as these soldiers. But the weapons they carried will not go with them. And at last it sinks in. They really have finally survived this war. They really are going to live. a moment that's more than enough to make grown men cry. And even though they were enemies, now they are among family. The Egyptian colonel whispers to the Iraqi prisoner on the ground in pain from a head wound. He comforts him. "It is all right, soldier. You are safe now. I, too, am an Arab. I am your brother." Richard Threlkeld with the Egyptian Army inside Kuwait.
With Kuwait City and the international airport now under Allied control, the focus of the war is expected to shift to Iraq, where Allied forces are surrounding divisions of the Republican Guard. In Washington, attention is turning to the question of how long the war should continue if, as it seems, Iraq has been defeated. CBS correspondent Randall Pinkston at the White House this morning had these thoughts to offer.
With the victory in sight, the senior administration officials here at the White House are also planning for post-war Iraq and the mission of U.S. troops. One senior administration official indicating that U.S. troops will have some kind of peacekeeping role, but the hope is that once the shooting is over, the peacekeeping role would be shared initially by Arab coalition members and then eventually turned over to them. How long will U.S. forces be in place? Well, that all depends on how long the Republican Guard continues to fight. And there's another issue, how much longer Iraq might continue throwing Scud missiles. Even when the shooting stops, if those Scuds continue, the senior administration official says the U.S. would respond accordingly. Another goal mentioned is getting getting Saddam Hussein out of power. And to do that, perhaps the sanctions might be continued once the war is over, or perhaps war reparations might be heavier than lighter. A lot of questions that the administration is considering in these, what appears to be the final hours of fighting in the Persian Gulf.
The CBS Breakfast Show also took up that theme with the Speaker of the House, Tom Foley, and Senator Richard Lugar, a leading Republican who's a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Mr. Speaker, the President is being criticized for continuing to attack the Iraqis even though they are retreating. Is the President doing the right thing?
Yes, I think he is. There is a demand, I think a legitimate demand on the part of the President, that these forces surrender, that the UN resolutions be agreed to. Under international law, military forces that are not surrendering are subject to the rules of war. The only way that they can achieve protection is to actually surrender. Now, the administration has also said if they leave the battlefield and leave their weapons and simply retreat directly to Iraq, that they won't be fired on.
And how far do you think we should drive the Iraqis back into Iraq, Mr. Speaker?
Well, I think the achievement of our goal is, the goal of the coalition is to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait. We do not have as a goal the occupation of Iraq over any period of time or anything that interferes with its territorial integrity. But of course, the question remains, will Saddam Hussein cease and desist all attacks by Scud, by other means on the region and on countries in the region, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and so on? If he were to use the sanctuary of his own country to continue those attacks, that would force a different policy on our part. We'd probably simply have to go forward as far as necessary to achieve the result, and that could mean to Baghdad. But I think otherwise it would be unwise for the United States to try to occupy the country in post-World War II style.
Senator Lugar, it has been suggested that after the war is over, that we continue economic sanctions against Iraq with the express purpose of perhaps forcing the people there to overthrow Saddam. What do you make of those reports?
Well, the President and certainly Secretary Baker have indicated that it would be much easier to bring about a reconstruction of war-torn Iraq with a different government. I have no doubt that the sanctions offer a type of leverage. Likewise, the startup of their oil revenues that flows through countries that are a part of the coalition might be an important part of that pressure. I would suspect that we will encourage the Iraqis to bring about a governmental structure that is easier for the world community to work with, and to leave it at that for the moment.
And finally, to the home front, a location which has inspired more purple prose from television correspondents than even the liberation of Kuwait. Bob McNamara went to a town in Montana where he said the people want their troops back from the Gulf, but not until their job is done.
Northwest Montana.
It's an area where people have tended to be prairie patriotic.
And for weeks they have prayed.
We pray for our loved ones who are in danger. We pray for a swift end to this war.
For weeks, too, Jim Griggs has printed signs of support for the troops at war.
It started with 700, and it's boomeranged. It's still going. Right now, we have 116,000 out.
It has really hit home to a lot of people.
We have about 25 soldiers in our little county that are serving over in the Persian Gulf.
All along U.S. Highway 2, in the town's time past long ago, today's war events ease worries only slightly for a son at war.
Our eyes are glued to the TV most of the time, and if it's not that, we're listening to the radio or shortwave or something to try to find out, something.
If anything might have briefly challenged patriotism, it was the ground war.
Well, I was very scared, but I'm glad it started, so I can get my husband home now.
Here, the only ones in the dark about the war are the arriving Amtrak passengers.
I've been very concerned.
Yeah.
Afraid it would be a bloody mess when they got started, but hopefully they've got it under control.
Still, there's fear of Saddam Hussein.
I believe if they don't do something now, he'll go back with his armaments and we'll end up fighting him again.
I hope they do it right because I don't want my grandchildren over there in 20 years and have to do it again.
In the meantime, under the big sky as elsewhere, hopes now are like early signs of spring, that sons and daughters will be coming back soon too.
And that review of the American media coverage of the Gulf was from Diana Goodman. But now, with a look at the American papers this morning, is the British correspondent Christopher Hitchens, who's in Washington and has spoken to us several times before. Chris Hitchens, this morning the newspapers presumably have had their first chance to have a go at the liberation of Kuwait.
Yes, they've been able to cover the liberation of the city. They've been able also to cover, very graphically, the pursuit of Iraqi forces in retreat. There's a front-page description in the Washington Post this morning of pilots talking about the turkey shoot, the fish in a barrel, and all the rest of it. And then on the editorial pages, there are increasingly discussions about what next.
And what sort of conclusions are people coming to? Or are we still, as we've seen in the past, the newspapers rather sitting on the fence saying the president has a problem?
The Washington Post, I would say, is rather on the fence today because it is principally preoccupied with justifying the continuation of war against Iraqi forces even in retreat. The New York Times takes a slightly longer view and anticipates what might happen if the fabric of Iraq is completely unraveled by all this, and urges in effect that the United States not permit that, and that it thinks beyond the present moment to the reconstruction of the country.
Overall, is there a celebratory note? We heard, I don't know if you were listening to that media coverage, and Dan rather almost in tears. Is there that sort of sense of euphoria in the newspapers as well?
Well, there's a sense, I think, more than anything, of relief and gratitude, just people unable to believe their luck, that everything seems to have gone as predicted, and even the remarks made last week, which sounded to some to have a tinge of hubris to them about the war proceeding on schedule, as they kept saying, don't appear to have been exaggerations. I mean, apparently there was a timetable. Apparently, if anything, the forces are ahead of it. And the casualties are very, very, very nearly nil. I mean, the only serious loss being a random Scud, or at any rate, a single Scud, hitting troops while they were playing basketball in the rear.
Now, there is this enormous upsurge of support, even from a very high level, of the president and his handling of the war. Is that reflected too?
Yes, the Times on its front page today has a long news analysis piece saying that, I mean the New York Times by that, of course, saying that it looks as if George Bush will be invulnerable in 1992. And indeed, if you think of what the Democrats are faced with simply by way of finding a candidate who could stand in the same limelight as the president currently does, I think you'll see that, that's becoming a very early and present calculation.
And it is an extraordinary thing, really, that it's impossible for opposition politicians to raise the doubts many must still have about this war aims question.
Well, I think that's right. It's being left to people like specialized columnists in the newspapers. And yesterday, Jim Hoagland, who's the Washington Post's man on this subject, warned that the Saudis, if they were allowed to, would go for a more or less authoritarian Sunni, probably military government for Iraq. He said he thought the United States should make democracy a war aim. Others have talked about the dangers of, if you like, a Lebanized Iraq, where the Shia, the Kurds, and the Sunni all start to fight among themselves, and possibly neighbors like Iran, Syria, and Turkey fish in troubled waters. And I think that this is the only note of reserve and admonition that you find in the press coverage these days, is the possibility that one might go too far. And occasionally people are reminded of how the Israeli outright military triumph in 1967 only led later to a deeper political quagmire.
What about the question of the pursuit of Saddam Hussein? Because we've talked to a lot of Kuwaitis today, you must have heard from a lot yourself as well. All of them believe that while he is still there, the threat remains, and that the Americans must not leave until he has been finally dealt with.
Yes, I think that there's a lone Republican congressman from Ohio who wants a congressional resolution for the assassination of Hussein. He surfaced again today, this time with slightly more publicity, calling for that option to be exercised, which would mean an executive order. Got a rather cold reception from the Speaker, but I think at what you might call demotic level of public opinion, it's probably semi-consciously assumed that it is a war aim of the United States to physically remove Saddam Hussein from power, if not from all earthly cares.
And is it worked out at all in the newspapers how this might be achieved while remaining within the context of the United Nations resolutions and within the limitations imposed by political pressures elsewhere, but in the Arab world, for instance?
That's right. One of the editorials this morning refers to the very vague but suggestive phrasing of one of the United Nations resolutions. I forget, I'm sorry, precisely which one, which talks of the mandate to restore a general peace and stability in the region. Under that rubric, it is held, the United States and the coalition is entitled to consider itself fit to decide the future government of Iraq. There is, however, unease that that's rather too broad an interpretation, and indeed there's doubt as to whether the United States is qualified for that task. But insofar as the single question of the survival of Saddam Hussein is concerned, I think there is no measure that could now be taken against him that would for long be held against the U.S. government. Not at least by its own public opinion.
Sorry, do you ever hear at all in the newspapers anything from the peace lobby, which occasionally launches its demonstrations, but presumably is rather quiet at the moment?
The American peace movement took the view early in the war that it wasn't going to be caught looking unpatriotic, and the slogan was, "We support the troops but not the war." Well, obviously that's rather an awkward thing to say when the troops are actually, as they are now, fighting the war, and as a result I think the peace movement has decided that a period of silence on its part would be prudent.
Christopher, finally, what about the personal anecdotes of soldiers? Is there much reporting of that sort, of soldiers telling their own stories of what it's like to have been involved in this battle in the desert?
Remarkably little of that so far, but I think that that's obviously going to be more and more easy to do as the situation relaxes in Kuwait City itself. I think there'll be more leisure time for the interviewing of soldiers than there has been in the first day.
And not even in the tabloid press do you get the sort of approach which we've seen throughout the war from newspapers like The Sun and Mirror in this country?
No, and in fact I would also say that there's been very little exactly what you might call gloating. There hasn't been anything of that sort yet either.
But the one thing President Bush said from the start was that this would not be another Vietnam, and one thing he seems to have achieved is that the soldiers presumably will return home as heroes and not as part of some operation which has lost the confidence of the people back home.
I think I can already see in my mind's eye the parade down Pennsylvania Avenue and also the many smaller parades that will take place in cities and towns around the country, and that I think people will not regard these as rehearsals for Bush in 1992. I think they'll regard them as genuinely national and patriotic events.
Christopher Hitchens, thank you very much for talking to us. It's bringing the time to the news summary at 3 o'clock.
BBC News at 3 o'clock. Allied military officers in the Gulf say Iraqi forces are almost completely encircled and coalition forces control the main escape routes from Kuwait. They say the Iraqi Republican Guard is trapped in southern Iraq. The Americans maintain that one of the Republican Guard's heavy armored divisions has been virtually destroyed after what is said to have been an attack by 500 American tanks. Iraq has conceded for the first time that coalition forces are operating deep inside its territory. A military communique said there'd been an Allied airborne landing near the town of Nasiriyah on the river Euphrates. The Prime Minister, Mr. John Major, has said the Kuwait city is now entirely free and the British troops are in the British embassy. The Americans say their Marines have succeeded in gaining control over the international airport after a 2-day battle. Egyptian military sources said Egyptian forces had captured the city's second airport. There have been scenes of jubilation as Kuwaiti troops swept through the outskirts of Kuwaiti city. Residents waved red and white headscarves in greeting and soldiers fired into the air. The Kuwaiti resistance has said that in the last days of the occupation, the Iraqis rounded up 5,000 citizens and took them away. A senior member of the resistance said he believed they were being taken to Baghdad to be used as hostages. President Bush is to discuss the Gulf War with the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Douglas Hurd, in Washington this afternoon. Mr. Hurd will also see the American Secretary of State, Mr. James Baker. There's been a gun and grenade attack at a hotel in the centre of Berlin, in which 3 American government workers were slightly injured. Police said the attacker was of Arab appearance. The high street banks and building societies have begun reducing their interest rates after the Bank of England cut its base rate by 0.5% to 13%. It's the second time in 2 weeks that the Bank of England has cut its rates. The Abbey National, the Halifax and the nationwide Anglia cut their mortgage rates by an average of 0.75%. BBC Radio News.
Clive Roslin, thank you very much indeed. Clive Roslin there, and this is Nick Clark. You're listening to Radio 4 News FM. As coalition forces continue to attack Iraqi tanks and vehicles on the move in Kuwait, peace campaigners in Britain have described the action as disgusting and barbaric. The question remains, should a retreating army be attacked as ruthlessly as one that stays to fight? Should the Iraqi forces just be allowed to go home carrying their weapons? Or are they a legitimate target until they lay down their arms? Valerie Jones reports.
For the pilots in the coalition forces, the convoys of Iraqi trucks and tanks moving from Kuwait towards Iraq are making easy targets. Amongst some of the American pilots, proud of their skill and success, there's a hint of euphoria.
I just spot the tank. It's nothing real cosmic. Got a reference in the cockpit, put it on there, go inside, lock it up, good lock, let her rip. It's the biggest 4th of July show you've ever seen. And to see those tanks just boom, and more stuff just keeps spewing out of them, and the shells flying on the ground, and they just become white hot. It's wonderful.
But that euphoria to other ears sounds distinctly distasteful. For the MP Ken Livingstone, there are echoes of the Vietnam War film Apocalypse Now, when American helicopters went into attack to the music of Wagner.
What we are now seeing is from United States aircraft carriers, flight after flight of fighters and planes taking off to the sound of the William Tell Overture to go on what they call a turkey shoot, shooting in the back retreating Iraqi soldiers who, with their own feet, are working to comply with the UN resolution to get out of Kuwait. And I think that image will live in the minds of Arab peoples for the rest of their lives.
For the International Red Cross, it's a matter of concern, though as François-Zen Ruffinen from the New York office points out, it's not illegal under the Hague Convention, which governs the rules of combat.
Legally speaking, even in retreating, and this is, I must emphasize, according to the law of war, the law of The Hague, and the humanitarian law, even in retreating, as long as an enemy has not surrendered and laid down his weapons, he can be considered as a military target and thus subject to the rules of war.
And the Red Cross want to remind Allied commanders to spare life where they can.
The ICRC cannot possibly interfere in the conduct of the hostilities themselves, and there is no legal basis for ICRC to do so. So ICRC would certainly draw the attention of the concerned parties of certain obligations, legal or moral obligations.
Labour MP Maria Fife believes the United Nations should now intervene.
Isn't there a difference between attacking an army or a division which is in full battle order and is retreating in order to gain a position from which to attack again, and attacking people who are simply in genuine headlong retreat, whose one aim in life is to get back home and see their families again? It may be difficult sometimes to tell the difference between what is one and what is the other, but that's why I think once again it's so essential that it is the United Nations which takes charge of what is going on, and it's the United Nations which should be deciding who are still worthy of attack, and of course most particularly it's the United Nations who should be deciding when victory has been won and they can say that the objectives of the UN resolutions have been achieved.
Sabah Jawad of the Iraqi Democrats who oppose Saddam Hussein says it's the Iraqi people who are suffering because of the continued meddling of the West.
Saddam Hussein, the monster, was created by Western and Eastern allies. And what we've been saying, what's been witnessing in the past months, is the people, the victim of Saddam Hussein, are being asked once again to pay the price in their blood and destruction of their own country.
The coalition forces say Saddam Hussein must formally surrender, and his troops must give up their arms. Our defence correspondent Mark Leahy in Saudi Arabia outlined their concerns.
The Allies have said if they abandon their weapons and walk, they won't be attacked. And there have been instances of that which were given to us by military sources this morning. But anyone who just retreats could be moving to reposition themselves. As we see here, in fact, the Republican Guard, we know, and some of the Iraqi regular army divisions are retreating to try and move away from Allied forces to reposition themselves for further combat. They clearly do not see themselves as out of action. And retreat is a part of military history. It's what people do when things are going wrong. It doesn't mean that they're not willing to fight. It just means that the situation requires them to retreat for now.
But Ken Livingston asks, how can the Iraqi troops give up their weapons if they're still being fired at?
If you're being shot as you retreat, you aren't going to leave the armoured vehicles you're in and walk. And the reality is that none of these soldiers are in a position to force Saddam Hussein to say anything. They are caught between Saddam Hussein and George Bush. George Bush is happy to slaughter them as an example to anybody else that gets in America's way in the future. And Saddam Hussein doesn't give a damn.
Ken Livingston ending that report by Valerie Jones. And just to underline a point which emerged in an interview earlier on this afternoon with Jassim Mohammed, a member of the Kuwaiti Assembly, who told us that some 22% of the initial reconstruction work during a 3-month emergency reconstruction plan, which is going to get underway very soon, is to be awarded to UK companies, 22%. There have been more clashes in the Egyptian capital Cairo between police and students protesting against the Gulf War. Police used tear gas and plastic bullets, but the students said police had shot dead at least 4 people. The police have not confirmed that there were any deaths. On the line now is our correspondent in Cairo, Alex Kirby. Alex, a day or two ago there were demonstrations, and it was rather felt, I thought, that the steam had gone out of them and that there would be no further trouble.
Yes, I think we did feel that yesterday because there was a demonstration both on the university campus and, remarkably, one that was allowed off it, and normally that's forbidden. And both of them passed off peacefully, so it did look as if the government was taking a much softer line and as if the trouble would blow over. I think probably what provoked today's trouble was the fact that students came out in quite large numbers, apparently carrying a coffin in commemoration of one of their number who was killed on Monday. And I think that when the security forces saw that, they thought they couldn't allow them to get away with it, and so they tackled them and pushed them back inside.
So this new demonstration didn't have anything to do in